Greetings, mortals. Hunger is the oldest curse. It rots the body, yes, but it starves the soul first. What happens when food runs out, and silence fills the air? When the snow doesn't melt or the river never rises? When cannibalism creeps into your thoughts? Do you begin to eat your fellow humans' calves like steak, or buttocks like sliced ham? They do say the human thigh is an excellent salami steak.
May 1933, Stalin's Soviet Union. The official term was social cleansing. The real plan was far less clean. The Soviet regime, deep in its campaign of dekulakization, cleansing the country of so-called class enemies, was overwhelmed with people. Homeless, jobless, accused, many were ordinary citizens caught without identity papers. Others were arrested for simply standing on the wrong street corner. They were rounded up by the thousands: peasants, urban poor, former prisoners, anyone deemed unproductive. The idea on paper was resettlement, build labor cities in remote territories, create order out of chaos. But in practice it became something else entirely. Over 6,000 people were loaded into overcrowded trains and barges under armed escort. Their destination, Nazino Island. Nazino is a tiny speck of land along the Ob River in western Siberia, about 2 miles long, a mile across, cold, marshy, choked with mosquitoes, no buildings, no shelter, no tools, no food. It was never intended to support human life. But that didn't stop them from being dumped there. The guards handed out nothing but sacks of flour. No pots, no containers, no instructions, just raw flour dropped into the mud and left to fate. People tried mixing the flour with dirty river water, turning it into a paste. Many choked. Some became violently ill. Diarrhea spread quickly. Weak bodies began to collapse. Within days, order broke down. Guards fired into crowds that fought over food. Some exiles began stealing, scavenging, turning on each other. Women were raped. Those with strong bodies dominated those without. By the end of the first week, there were already corpses. And then came the hunger. The first cannibalism wasn't hidden. It happened in the open. Survivors described people cutting strips of flesh from corpses and roasting them on sticks. A woman was caught with a piece of thigh wrapped in cloth. Another prisoner, a young man, lured a girl into the woods with the promise of food, then killed her. Her liver was found in his cookpot. Guards knew. Some intervened. Most didn't. In one case, 2 men were caught with a boiled human heart. Another account spoke of hunters who moved in packs, watching the weak, waiting, not for death, for stillness. A witness wrote, "They stopped waiting for people to die. They started helping them die." One woman's legs were hacked off while she still breathed. A man awoke to find his arm gone. His attackers had used a belt as a tourniquet to keep him alive longer. There was no more shame, no more screaming, only hunger. In 13 weeks, over 4,000 people died. Some drowned trying to swim to shore. Others froze. Some were beaten or shot. Many starved, and more than a few were eaten. One of the few guards who later gave testimony said, "There was a moment when I stopped seeing them as people. They were like animals in a pit, and then I realized I was still one of them." Medical staff refused to stay on the island. Some survivors were evacuated once the situation could no longer be ignored, but many of those who lived were rearrested later and sent to labor camps, never to be heard from again. Those who stayed behind buried what they could, but most of the dead were left to rot or drift into the river. The entire operation had been an experiment. Nazino Island was the brainchild of Genrikh Yagoda, deputy head of the Soviet secret police. The plan was to establish special settlements in Siberia where the undesirables could work and farm, build infrastructure, reinvent themselves. Nazino was supposed to be the first test. When it failed, catastrophically, it was buried. Reports were hidden. Officials were reassigned or demoted quietly. Survivors were never officially interviewed. But in 1989, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, documents began to surface. A full report from the Tomsk Regional Committee revealed exact figures: 6,114 deportees, no medical screening, no food logistics, 27 guards total, and at least 50 confirmed cases of cannibalism reported before records stopped. Yagoda was later executed during the Great Purge, but Nazino was never addressed in public by the state. Today, the island is overgrown, quiet. There are no signs to mark what happened there. Locals avoid it. Fishermen won't dock there. One village elder told researchers, "You don't go there in spring. That's when they scream." The bones have long been picked clean, but every once in a while the river unearths one. A fragment, a skull, a jawbone, and the story resurfaces, briefly, before disappearing again beneath the reeds. When asked years later why people didn't fight harder, didn't resist, didn't try to escape, one survivor said simply, "You don't run when there's nowhere to go. You wait. And if you're lucky, someone dies before you do." They called it Cannibal Island. But it wasn't the name that haunted them. It was the silence. In the spring of 1846, 90 people left Springfield, Illinois, bound for California. They were families, laborers, children, ordinary settlers chasing extraordinary promises, land, gold, and a future they could call their own. They packed wagons with flour, bacon, rifles, heirlooms, Bibles. Some even brought violins. They were ready for a journey, but not this journey. By the time the snows thawed the following spring, nearly half would be dead, and those who survived would do so by eating the ones who didn't. They were later named the Donner Party, but that name didn't come from the beginning. It came from the end. George and Jacob Donner, successful farmers, were among the leaders of the wagon train. Alongside them was James F. Reed, a more outspoken figure with aspirations of leadership. The group was strong, united, until they made a fateful choice. In Wyoming, they chose to leave the established trail and take a supposed shortcut, the Hastings Cutoff. Lansford Hastings had never tested the route himself, but his maps looked convincing. The detour was a trap. It dragged the party across the salt flats of Utah, where wagons sank, oxen died, and wheels cracked under blistering heat. They lost weeks of progress. By the time they reached the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, the calendar had turned. October had come. Snow was whispering from the peaks. And then, without warning, it roared. A blizzard sealed the mountain passes. Wagons were abandoned. Horses bolted. The remaining members built crude shelters near what's now Donner Lake, then called Truckee Lake. There, they waited. The food dwindled, then disappeared. They boiled animal hides, stripped bark from trees, scraped marrow from bones. They melted snow for water. Babies cried. The old simply stopped speaking, and slowly, the silence grew thicker than the snow. Then came the forlorn hope. 17 people strapped makeshift snowshoes to their feet and set out into the mountains to find help. It was a desperate plan. Most had no wilderness experience, but waiting meant death. They got lost. They froze. Some turned back. The rest made a choice. They began with the dead. But when even that wasn't enough, some say they drew straws. Others say one man was shot deliberately. When they were finally found by Native American trackers, only 7 were still alive. Their eyes were blank, their mouths silent, but their packs were not empty. Back at camp, the bodies piled higher. Some died alone in their shelters, bodies found months later frozen in positions of prayer. Others were cannibalized in full view, legs missing, torsos hollowed. A few survivors later claimed that not all of the eating was post-mortem. Some were hunted. Luis and Salvador, 2 Native American guides who fled when they realized what was happening, were pursued, shot, and consumed. The lines between survival and selection began to blur. The first relief party arrived in February 1847. They found what one rescuer described as a scene from hell. Children guarding rib cages, charred bones in cooking pots, frozen corpses stacked in corners. One girl, delirious, refused to leave until someone helped carry her mother's head. Of the 87 original members, 47 survived. The rest were buried in shallow snowdrifts, or not buried at all. The aftermath was complicated. Some survivors became public figures, celebrated for their endurance. Others were vilified. James Reed, who made it to California early and helped organize rescue efforts, lived out his life in relative peace. Others were not so lucky. Many survivors reported lifelong nightmares, visions of the dead, phantom footsteps outside their windows. Some refused to eat meat ever again. A few took their own lives in the years that followed. Children raised by survivors would speak of hearing stories not told in public, of fires lit with bone, of decisions made in whispers, of parts rationed like soup. One journal entry from a 12-year-old girl simply said, "We ate the ones we loved." Today, Donner Pass is known for its scenic beauty. A monument stands, tall and solemn. Tourists ski the slopes. They snap photos beside a stone plaque, but the ground beneath holds more than snow. Each year, the melt reveals new artifacts, tools, wagon nails, sometimes bone fragments. The stories have never stopped. Locals say that on the coldest nights, you can hear knocking from the trees. Others claim the wind whistles through the lake not like a howl, but like a scream. The survivors lived on, but they carried something with them that never thawed. Not shame, not regret, just memory. And memory is colder than snow. Hunger doesn't knock. It doesn't announce itself. It slips in, quiet, slow, until every thought, every instinct, every shred of morality bends beneath its weight. In Siberia and in the Sierra Nevadas, 2 groups of people, separated by an ocean and a century, were reduced to the same decision. Not who they were, but what they were willing to eat. Nazino was supposed to be a settlement. It became a slaughter. Thousands were sent to build a new future. They built nothing. No roads, no homes, no history. Only graves, some shallow, some open. And when they ran out of dirt, they let the bones pile. They didn't bury the dead because the dead had become currency, rations, survival, and the government pretended it never happened. The Donner Party was supposed to be a migration. It became a warning. They chased the American dream into a white wilderness and watched it freeze. They boiled boots, burned family keepsakes. Then, when the bodies stopped breathing, they stopped waiting. And yet, they were remembered not for what they did, but for what they endured, what they lived through and lived with. In both places, silence followed. A government that erased the records, a public that only wanted headlines. A group of survivors who never spoke of what the meat tasted like. Maybe they forgot, or maybe they never stopped tasting it. History likes to ask, what would you have done? But hunger doesn't ask questions. It answers them. It shows you what you are when nothing else is left. The people on Nazino Island weren't monsters. The Donner Party weren't beasts. They were us. In a different place, in a different winter.
Eating people like steak, their calf muscles like prosciutto, buttocks like ham. These were tales far too complicated for human perception to understand. Until next time, mortals.